Okay.
Thank you, Salma.
Okay, did you get the email?
Yes, I already sent the email. Thank you. So, we can start, Salma.
Yes, we are live streaming at the moment. You can go ahead.
Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today to the Education in Emergency Learning Community. My name is Luis Eduardo Perez Murcia, the Global Campaign for Education Policy and Research Advisor, and I am so pleased to be you all here celebrating with us the 2022 International Day of the Girl Child. So I will be sharing and introducing the session, but before that, I want to introduce our speakers. First of all, we are going to have Mr. Bernard Muñoz Villalobos, the GCE Head of Advocacy and Policy and Campaigns, who will be sharing with us some of the key ideas, key elements of the GCE gender strategy. After that, we are going to have Mrs. Stephanie Foster, author and co-founder of Smash Strategies, who will be talking about the global conflict and its disproportionate impact on girls' education. After that, we are going to have Sumita Chowdhury, the Capacity Support and Advocacy Advisor of ASBAE. Thank you, Sumita, for joining us at the very last minute with short notice. After that, we are going to have a 5-minute break, mainly for interpretation purposes. Thank you very much indeed, interpreters, for your work and support with us. And after the break, we are going to have Dr. Maria Guadalupe Ramos Ponce, a professor and researcher at the Universidad de Guadalajara, who will be sharing with us her really long-term research about feminicides in Mexico and some of the impacts on girls' education. And then we are going to have Teresa Omondi Adeitan. I don't know if Teresa is already in the call. She is the FAWI Deputy Executive Director, and she will be just trying to reach some example from African countries about the challenges for girls' education in context of emergency. After that, we are going to have Angela Fischer and Lauren Supina supporting the Q&A, moderating that. They work for Take Action, and they have been really engaged with this webinar. Thank you, Lauren and Angela, for your support with this. And at the end, I will be just closing the session. So before giving the floor to Bernard Muñoz Villalobos, I just want to highlight 3 reasons because the Global Campaign for Education is celebrating this day. First of all, because we acknowledge that in most regions of the world, girls and women are really left behind in terms of their education opportunities. They often have less chances than men to fulfill their fundamental rights. They face poverty, inequality, and multiple forms of exclusion and injustice. According to the UN, in 70% of the world countries, women have less chances to enjoy the right to education. So that is very significant. Second, in context of conflict, climate change, and other emergencies, including the ongoing health pandemic, women have been consistently left behind, and we can see women in refugee camps and in other displaced settlements with little opportunities to attend school and enjoy the right to education. And finally, celebrating this day is an opportunity for the Global Campaign for Education and all its partners to further advocate and campaign for women's rights in general, and in particular for the right to education. So that's all for me from the introduction. Over to you, Bernard, and thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you very much, Luis Eduardo, and greetings, everyone. My very best wishes from Costa Rica. So as Luis Eduardo just pointed out, the gender education crisis is affecting 129 million girls and young women and 128 boys and young men who are currently out of school. But, data is not always accurate, but this is the figures that we found in most of the data basis. But we also know that girls are disproportionately out of school at the primary level, whereas boys are more likely to be out of school at secondary education levels, with obviously significant regional differences. Children and other sexual orientations, gender identities or expressions or sexual characteristics are visible in this global data. We know that 150 million girls are likely to be married early by 2030, and many of them will become mothers early too. So this is clearly a cause and consequence of girls' education dropout. While globally, almost 94% of teachers in pre-primary education are female, in low-income countries, it is only 41%, illustrating the strong gender dynamics that drive inequality also in the education system. So in order to respond to this crisis, GCE recently adopted a gender strategy. This has been a historical debt for the movement, but now we have it in place. So this gender strategy will be useful to reinforce our gender transformative potential, turning our plans and strategies into more effective vehicles and sensitive to change that is intended to be obtained in public policies. The strategy is also aimed at achieving a lasting and profound impact on the realization of the right to education for girls, adolescents, and women, strengthen the inclusion perspective and address the needs of sexually diverse people, advance the enforceability of human rights, including the destruction of masculinity roles, and inspire internal changes in the GCE movement and member organizations so that gender perspective is mainstream. So the strategy is focusing in 4 main areas, which very much enter in dialogue with the strategic plan, the GCE strategic plans. So the first one is gender equality and non-discrimination. The second one is gender transformative education. So here our goal is to promote an education that dismantle patriarchy and raises awareness on current and historical global inequalities. The third one is the gender responsive education in conflict and crisis. So we want to make education in emergency gender and conflict responsive to address the gender dynamics in conflict. And the fourth one is the gender responsive education financing. So our goal here is that education financing policies and plans should fulfill the international obligations and should be responsive to the needs of people of all genders, but specifically girls and women. So with this strategy, we're aiming to strengthen our movement and to mobilize resources in order to respond to girls and women's rights, as well as sexually diverse people. So I will not go in details into the strategy, but I will be happy to respond to any question you might have at the end of the webinar. Thank you so much, Luis Eduardo.
Thank you, Bernard. Thank you very much for this brief introduction of the gender strategy that really frames our discussion today. Now I will give the floor to Mrs. Stephanie Foster. Thank you, Stephanie, for making time for this session. It's a pleasure for the Global Campaign for Education having you here, sharing with us your experience in different corners of the world. Over to you, Stephanie.
Well, thank you. And thank you so much for having me today. And thank you, of course, for the work you do to ensure that everybody has equal access to education, particularly girls and young women. So I want to thank you for that before I start my part of the conversation. I think the most important thing, we all know a lot of the statistics, although I'm going to just reaffirm them right now, that 1 in 5 adolescent girls, 20% of adolescent girls in the world live in conflict-affected countries or conflict zones. And we know that, first of all, that's a tremendous number, and it also has a tremendous impact on those countries' overall development. Conflict, of course, is destabilizing by definition, but it's even more destabilizing for the most vulnerable, for young women and girls in particular, and in particular disrupting, of course, the ability of young women and girls to have access to education. We know that there are, of course, overlays that exist for all, young women and girls across the globe. The gender digital divide, we've particularly seen how COVID-19 has highlighted that. Gender norms around expectations about girls' access to education, particularly at the secondary level. And as was mentioned before, the idea that well, at the primary level, there's fairly equitable access to education. At the secondary level, girls really often do drop out of school. In some countries, it's different. There are more girls in school than boys, but it is a very, I think, unique set of experiences in each country. Education, of course, drives everything in a country. It has an impact on the economic prosperity in a country. It has an impact on the ability of all of its citizens to participate in politics and education, civic education. So without equitable access to education, we really see countries and communities much less stable and much less resilient. So I think those are some of the most important things to think about. Of course, we know, again, as mentioned, that as conflict and I would say conflict is something that we often sort of use as an umbrella term to talk about conflict. Emergency settings, those can be things around climate change, humanitarian crisis, all these sorts of destabilizing events in a community. So displacement, of course, has a negative impact in general on young women and girls. And violence then, of course, sort of rises to the top. I want to say a couple of things just at the outset as well. We know that 54% of the out of school young people right now are girls are in conflict affected zones, as I said, and 20% of adolescent girls live in conflict settings. These are really troubling statistics. I think there are things that we can do to address the issues that have come up through this. Obviously, talking about funding is critically important, legal frameworks, international pressure. But one thing I really think we need to focus on is how we actually get girls and young women engaged in this conversation. We know that every country and community is different. We know that there are impacts on girls' education that come from conflict. We know there are impacts on girls' education that come from gender-based violence in schools. We know there are attacks on schools that can have a disproportionate impact on young girls, young women and girls. And so all of those three things come together in different bundles in conflict across the globe. And critically important, I think, is that how we listen to the young women and girls in those countries talk about themselves, what they think needs to be done to address the issues that they face. These are critically important times for them, very, very defining times in their lives. And they are facing, in a lot of times, very, very challenging situations. As we have on the slide, early marriage, of course, increases in conflict zones. The adolescent girls and young women who live there are 20% more likely to marry early, obviously more, likely to become pregnant early. There's all sorts of, other implications that come out of these situations for these young women. And so I think the more that we can understand, of course, the focus on these issues, and as policymakers are asking policymakers to gather data and to pass laws and to fund all these issues, I think it's critically important that we understand in each context what exactly these young women and girls would see as helpful to them, as policies and programs that would actually help address the issues that they face. So these are really critical points. Really critical as well is the idea that we need to link access to education to all of the other issues that we know are critically important globally around building prosperous and safe and secure communities. For example, research shows that if men and women participated equally in the labor force in every country at the equal rate in their country, not at 100%, but if it's 70% for men, 70% for women in a particular country, or whatever the data is, that global GDP would rise somewhere between 12 and $25 trillion, which is the combined GDPs of the United States and China, the world's two largest economies. But we can't do that, right? We can't build more prosperous communities with equitable access to the economy unless young women, young men, and boys and girls have equitable access to education. And so I think we need to ensure that as we're talking about education, we're linking that work to broader issues. This may seem very basic to all of us because this is what we do every day. But I think sometimes when we're talking to other people who are interested, but perhaps not as in the weeds, they don't actually think about the connection between this, access to education and building stronger economies necessarily, or ensuring that everybody is able to equitably participate in civil society or politics, or make their views known in the public square. So I think the more that we can make these connections for people, that the better we are to really push forward on equitable access to education. I think this is true, obviously, in every country, but most importantly true in countries where we see that there's been a tremendous amount of conflict. I looked at a report when I was getting ready for this webinar, and right now there are at least 44 or 45 countries that are considered to be in conflict across the globe. And that's a pretty daunting number when you think about it. 24 of the 44 are somewhere in Africa, and with the rest scattered around the globe. We can often name those countries because we read about them in the news, but there are a lot of countries that people don't focus on that have a conflict situation in part of their country, or they have a refugee situation, or a climate-induced crisis. So the more that we can, again, highlight the importance of education, linking it to more stability and security, more economic prosperity, more ability for people to really participate in their societies in the most equitable way, I think the better we will be able to really engage others in this important work, in the important work that the Global Campaign does, in the important work that people do around the world to really ensure that girls and young women have equitable access to education. One last thing I do want to talk about, and I know that COVID-19 again has brought this to the forefront, but I think we see this generally, is that we can't assume that everybody has equal access to the tools they need to access education, right? Not everyone has access to the internet, or maybe they have access to the internet, but it's not, broadband or 4G or 5G or even 3G. And so while we talk about how to structure alternative ways to obtain education, oftentimes, especially in COVID, we've talked a lot about online education. I think we need to be careful so that we're looking at whether or not that actually is available in particular countries and communities, and looking at whether or not community-based education, bringing education to communities, particularly to young women and girls at the grassroots level, whether or not that is something that actually works in that community. It hopefully is a stopgap measure. I think the studies all show that alternative education, whether it's online or sort of a community-based, school or education system, is good. It's better than not having access to education, but it really needs to be a stopgap until, you know, students can get back in schools and really learn. So I think we really need to understand the role of alternative education, but also its limitations. And lastly, I mean, I would be remiss if I didn't say this, because I have lived in Afghanistan and worked there. You know, we are obviously have a country in conflict in Afghanistan where girls have no access to secondary education. And I think which is wrong, but I think we'll also be looking at probably globally, how that has an impact on the country going forward. It's really hard to rebuild a country, to ensure that a country can compete, to ensure that a country can provide aid and assistance and the services that its citizens need if half the population isn't given access at all to secondary education. So I think these are very challenging times right now, but the good news is I do think there is consensus around the globe about the importance of equitable access to education for girls, young women, young men and boys. And also, I think one thing that I'll just put on the table to leave with is access to education isn't enough. We need to also think about access to quality education so that it's good to get kids in school, obviously, but we want to make sure that what they're learning, that they're learning. And so I think that's an issue that has been raised numerous times about the focus that we've all had internationally on access to education, is that getting in the classroom is the first step. The second step is ensuring that the curriculum really helps, again, girls, boys, young men, young women learn and have the ability to develop critical thinking skills, which are important to them, but important to their families and their communities and their countries. So I look forward to the rest of the conversation and, of course, happy to answer any questions that people might have. So I thank you so much for including me.
Thank you, Stephanie. Thank you very much. And thank you for making that clear, your very last point. Access is not enough. We also need to think about quality. And indeed, the Global Campaign for Education and its members use the so-called 4A framework. We are looking at accessibility, acceptability, adaptability, and all these elements are really important to really make sense of the rights to education for women and girls. So now I will give the floor to our colleague, Susmita. Susmita, thank you very much for joining us today. And the floor is yours, 15 minutes.
Thank you very much, Louis. Can I just share my screen? Thank you.
It's okay.
Can you see my screen?
We see the screen now.
Yeah.
Go ahead, please.
Okay. So I will start from where Stephanie actually left, is Afghanistan, since I'm supposed to talk about the Asia Pacific region. So I start with the country which is in conflict for the past 43 years. And as all of us, we know that before the collapse, the situation was totally different, where several million girls used to attend school, and there were 74,000 female teachers, 800 university female lecturers, which totally changed majorly from last year, August. The education system of a country has totally been destroyed. And as Stephanie said, that girls are devoid of any kind of education. And of lately, what has also started is a specific kind of discrimination and hatred towards a particular community, which is the Hazara community, and there are a lot of campaign going on against this at the moment. So what we see is that in the women and girls, they are the most affected with this, and they are unable to get back to school. They are, even when there has been a lot of international communities pressure, the Taliban government has said that they will, I should not talk about as a Taliban government, the Taliban actually, they have said that they will come up with a curriculum which is in accordance with their Sharia laws. But unfortunately, when we heard from the young girls from Afghanistan, they said that it means that it will just totally they will get rid of the important subjects of English, science, etc., and reinforce some religious and political ideologies, which is going backwards. So the young Afghan women and girls, they will miss the learning of the critical skills, which will also can help them for employment opportunities. Many of you may already know that in the last 2-3 months, what they have also started is that even if the women who were working, they can go back to their workplace or with a male companion, or they can actually replace them with a male person of the same family. So whether the male person is skilled or not doesn't matter, but the male person can get the job which was being done by the female. So which is the kind of a madness that is happening at the moment in the country. I'm sharing what we gather from our national education coalitions who are working there very quietly and as much with security as it possible, that the community there, they really want the girls and the young women to go back to education, to go back to schools and universities. So the urge is that a collective responsibility to ensure that the Sustainable Development Goal 4 is implemented, and the urge is to the international community to look into how is this possible, because the sanctions by the international community on the country has also made the situation much more grave, because there is high poverty, there is no cash flow, there is no there is immense poverty within the country. So thinking of education, thinking of health,
Hi, I can't hear anything, Susmita. It's only me, Salma.
No, Louise, her screen has, or her PC has actually froze. I'm trying to see if there's anything I can do for her. I think it's just a connectivity problem on her side.
Okay, maybe we can just wait. Okay, she left. Maybe she's trying to rejoin. Sorry about these technical issues, everyone. So please bear with us for a minute. We are trying to see what happened with Sumita.
Luis, I don't know from where I got dropped.
Yes, but now I can hear you, Susmita. Please just
Okay.
resume where you were.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah.
And if you want to share the screen, yes, do it again. And please just move because I only see the first slide.
Yeah, actually, sorry. I think it didn't move. Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Now, yes.
So I don't know from where I got dropped. I'm keeping my video off because of the connectivity.
That is absolutely fine, yes.
Thank you. So it is the urge to the international community that the sanctions need to be revisited, or what kind of other ways, or whether the negotiation that is going on in Doha, that we know with the Taliban, how much there is any progress at all in that, because nowadays what is happening, we see is that even the media coverage has been restricted, and the media has totally gone into the war that is happening in the country, in Ukraine and Russia. So there is a less number of information that is coming out of the country, and whatever I managed to gather is from the National Education Coalition. From here, I would like to share about a country, Myanmar, which is also in a very grave situation, one of the most inflicted country in the Asia Pacific region. You know that Myanmar has been going through a very difficult time, and there is hardcore poverty, there is the military aggression, and almost 12 million children, as per UNICEF, has missed school. There is the widening gap between the rich and the poor students. There is any student or young person who is protesting is being identified as the military, and they are detained or put into jail, and all sorts of things. Many professors and teachers are also put into jail. The National Education Coalition of ASPE, which in Myanmar, they are actually now operating from outside of Myanmar, from Thailand, Chiang Mai. However, there is some green light that we see, is that in Myanmar, we have seen the emergence of the community education movement, where with the military takeover and the close down of the schools, the community education initiative has started within the communities with support of parents, community leaders, churches, civil society organizations, and also UN agencies. So it depends on specific ethnic groups. Like Kachin, Karen, and Mon, they have their own ethnic education providers within the country. And for the other ethnic community, they also have the community education that is happening in the country. It is not easy when the military is everywhere, but this is one way that the country, the community, and with the support of the civil societies and others, they are trying to see how best they can reach out to the children. As part of the community education movement, they believe that classroom can be everywhere if the people want to, and the power of sharing and solidarity are the strength to move forward. So that's another area where which I wanted to share with you all. The third country that I want to share is about Philippines, and together I will share about Nepal, because we have been talking about conflict which is human-made, but we have countries in Asia Pacific where conflict or like emergency situations which is by climate, which is through natural disasters, is also very much there. For example, countries like Philippines, Nepal, where we know the geographical situation of the country is so much disaster prone. So in Philippines, we have seen that they have come up with a policy review, like how best they can come up, how best they can come up with the resilience education, where they are talking about inclusion of primary health care, life skills, gender awareness, reproductive health, positive discipline, human rights, leadership, etc. While they are talking about also math, science, English subjects as essential in the curriculum. So the curriculum should not be only math, science, English, and different other subjects, but also it should include those gender awareness, life skills, and others. In Philippines, they have also started as resilience education alternative learning system, where it is online as well as face-to-face as and when it is possible. Ensuring health and wellness of the education frontliners, education advocates, the teachers, because in COVID-19, it has been seen that they are really affected, because the teachers, they were part of as the frontliners, and they were also infected with COVID. They also want to revisit the existing law that is there on Children's Emergency Relief and Protection Act, and look into what are the gaps, and also adapt it as per the new normal that we see now after COVID. In Nepal, as we know, earthquake-prone, flash flood-prone country. So Nepal, National Campaign for Education Nepal, in support with the government, they are trying to protect public education in all situations, whether it is emergency, pandemic, disasters, or any kind of political activities. Finally, I will talk about Indonesia, which has multiple types of disaster. So it's not only climate-prone disaster, but also conflict, which is human-made. We know Indonesia, they have this kind of conflict as well. So what they are focusing on is to recover, reimagine, and rebuild stronger Indonesia, which is also part of the G20 vision, where they want to ensure universal quality education, as we heard in the previous presentation, that not only education, but what kind of learning outcomes that we can see. So quality education, access to education, how best we can use the digital technologies, considering in mind, like I come from India, I know digital divide is a major issue which in all over Asia Pacific and India as well. How to work in solidarity and in partnership, that is rebuilding, and therefore look into how we can get into a better, stronger community. So that's from my side at this moment. Any questions? I'm happy to respond. Louis, over to you. I'm very sorry for the disaster. This is again a digital disaster. It happened in between my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Sunita. Thank you very much. Yes, all the cases you are bringing today just remind us that how multiple emergencies interplay and all of them affect in different ways women's and girl right to education. So we are very, yes, 7:14 my time. So we probably going to the next speaker before the break, if that is okay with you all. So I will welcome Dr. Maria Guadalupe Ramos. Maria Guadalupe, the floor is yours.
Hola, ¿qué tal? Muy buenos días, buenas tardes, buenas noches, depende de donde nos estén escuchando. Un gusto saludarles desde México y bueno, muchísimas gracias a quienes están acá. Permítanme un momentito para compartir una presentación y me da, bueno, muchísimo gusto estar acá con todas y con todos ustedes para hablar del impacto que tiene en la educación, particularmente una de las problemáticas más graves, que es el tema de la violencia de género, los feminicidios. Permítame, me hace un momentito porque se me extravió acá mi presentación, un momentito. Didi.
Louise, her connection has dropped.
María Guadalupe, ¿tú me oyes? I see María Guadalupe in the call, but maybe... Hi, María Guadalupe.
Sonia,
No,
she's
ya,
on mute.
perdón, ya estoy de regreso, perdón, estoy tratando ahora sí para compartir esta presentación y por favor me avisan si está todo bien.
Ya se ve, María Guadalupe. Si puedes hacerla un poquito más... Eso, perfecto. Se ve muy bien. Puedes comenzar. Gracias.
Ahí está. Muchas gracias. Bueno, quise comenzar con esta imagen que es muy fuerte, sin duda. Es una pintura de Frida Kahlo que ella pintó en 1934 y que la llamó Unos cuantos piquetitos. Así es la nota periodística que ella leyó en esa época de un tipo que había matado a su esposa, y cuando el juez le pregunta que por qué la mató, le dice, pues si yo solamente le di unos cuantos piquetitos, en realidad la mató a puñaladas, y así de esa manera tan cruenta aparece. Y ella, Frida Kahlo, quiso justamente reflejar este machismo y esta naturalización de la violencia que se hace, ¿no? Bueno, la violencia basada en el género es un mecanismo social clave para perpetuar la subordinación de las mujeres. ¿Cuál es el factor de riesgo o vulnerabilidad? El solo hecho de ser mujeres, el solo hecho de ser niñas. Esta violencia ha sido legitimada socialmente, ha sido un dispositivo de control sobre los cuerpos, sobre los deseos. Hay un continuum de violencia que afecta en las distintas etapas de la vida de las niñas y de las mujeres, y su forma más extrema termina con el feminicidio. Celia Amorós, filósofa española, nos señalaba que la violencia ejercida contra las mujeres es una violencia sexista, patriarcal, que se perpetúa debido a esta posición de subordinación de las mujeres en este orden patriarcal, en esta hegemonía masculina que se basa en el control social de lo femenino. Bueno, ha habido una evolución histórica del derecho a vivir una vida libre de violencia. Hemos pasado de, primero, a visibilizar la existencia de esta violencia, ¿no? que ha estado incorporada en este entramado social y cultural. Ha sido necesaria deslegitimar la violencia contra las niñas y las mujeres y sobre todo reconceptualizarla como un problema social. Relacionar la violencia contra las mujeres con esta posición de subordinación que como género tenemos las mujeres en la sociedad. Y el culmen, ya les decía yo, de esta violencia, pues es el feminicidio, ¿no? El feminicidio, que es la manifestación más extrema de estos actos sistemáticos de violencia contra las niñas, contra las mujeres, por el hecho de ser mujeres, por el hecho de ser niñas, ¿no? La privación de la vida de una mujer en cualquier etapa de la vida, motivada por la misoginia que implica el desprecio, discriminación y este poco valor que se tiene hacia la vida de las niñas y de las mujeres. Y que a esto además le sumamos la impunidad, ¿no? En el tema del acceso a la justicia, la falta de investigación que se sigue en estos casos y por lo tanto hay una responsabilidad del Estado. Si bien hemos tenido algunos avances normativos al respecto, sobre todo en cuestión del reconocimiento de la violencia contra las niñas y las mujeres como un asunto de violación a sus derechos humanos, que nos ha llevado a la construcción jurídica de las mujeres como sujetas del derecho y no solo como objeto del mismo, ¿no? Como activas titulares del derecho y no como receptoras pasivas de beneficios discrecionales. Este reconocimiento también ha permitido que el discurso y la práctica en materia de derechos humanos se vuelvan más integrales al abarcar el derecho de las mujeres a una vida libre de violencias. Este proceso ha implicado el tránsito de leyes contra la violencia de género en los últimos años en América Latina, el Caribe y en el mundo también, al pasar de considerar la violencia doméstica o la violencia en el ámbito familiar para esta concepción más amplia e integral de la violencia de género y en particular la violencia contra las mujeres y la tipificación del feminicidio en los países de América Latina. Hemos también ido cambiando nuestro lenguaje, la manera en que hablamos de la violencia contra las niñas y las mujeres, ¿no? Dejamos de hablar de las muertas de Juárez, porque no murieron de muerte natural, las asesinaron, ¿no? Son las asesinadas de Ciudad Juárez, hablando de esta problemática que por algún tiempo se centró en una zona del país, en la frontera del país, la frontera con Estados Unidos. No es un fenómeno el feminicidio, es una problemática, el feminicidio, una problemática a la que hay que encontrarle solución a esa grave situación que existe de extrema violencia contra las mujeres que culmina en el feminicidio. No es violencia hacia las mujeres, es violencia contra las mujeres, es una violencia dirigida particularmente a ellas, a las niñas, a las mujeres. Y este lenguaje en medios del crimen pasional, esta imagen que yo les mostraba al inicio del crimen por amor, no existen los crímenes por amor ni crímenes pasionales. Hay que comenzar a hablar adecuadamente justo para visibilizar esas violencias y nombrarlas como son. Bueno, la violencia contra las mujeres y el feminicidio tiene particularmente dos elementos que nos dan cuenta de qué es, de dónde va esta problemática, y justo para encontrar o para tratar de encontrarle solución a la problemática, ¿no? Entonces, yo cuando les hablo de esto, les digo que la violencia contra las mujeres y el feminicidio tiene dos elementos. Uno, que es estructural y que es sistémica, ¿no? ¿Y a qué me refiero con esto? Bueno, es que hay toda una estructura y todo un sistema que promueve, permite, genera violencia contra las mujeres. Y de las estructuras estoy hablando, las estructuras jurídicas, políticas, económicas, sociales, ¿no? Entonces hay que ir desenraizando, hay que ir deconstruyendo desde todos esos ámbitos estas violencias y que están así en estos sistemas sociales en los que vivimos, ¿no? Para para lograr la erradicación final de estas violencias, ¿no? Es decir, no solamente la atención, la sanción, pero la aspiración nuestra debe ser la erradicación de esas violencias, ¿no? La violencia de género y feminicidio es tanto causa como consecuencia de las desigualdades que vivimos, ¿no? Todas las mujeres y las niñas del mundo, sin importar su origen, edad, condición social, religión, identidad de género u orientación sexual, están expuestas al riesgo de ser víctimas de la violencia. Sin embargo, le intersectan además diferentes variables, como la situación de pobreza, la pertenencia étnica, la condición de discapacidad, el estatus migratorio, entre otras cuestiones que aumentan su vulnerabilidad y las condiciones de enfrentar barreras adicionales para acceder a la justicia o a algún servicio de apoyo. Y bueno, y aquí ya voy aterrizando justo también, después de tener este contexto más amplio, a el tema que nos atrae hoy justamente en el Día Internacional de las Niñas, ¿no? Y de ver de qué manera afectan estas violencias, el feminicidio particularmente en las niñas y en la educación. Y yo aquí quiero centrar la mirada en dos aspectos. Uno, el feminicidio infantil, es decir, estos asesinatos de niñas, y el otro, la orfandad por feminicidio. ¿No? Son dos problemáticas que están presentes y que siguen un poco soterradas e invisibilizadas, ¿no? La cantidad de niñas y niños que son, después de que asesinan a su mamá, ¿cuál es la situación de ellas y de ellos? Y el otro caso de niñas, una gran problemática, el de las niñas asesinadas, los feminicidios infantiles. Bueno, el feminicidio infantil es cuando las víctimas son menores de edad, así lo señala ONU, mujeres y demás. En el caso de las niñas se conjunta además de la edad, las relaciones asimétricas de género y las relaciones asimétricas de edad, es decir, en esta edad en la que se encuentran también en una situación de vulnerabilidad. Por lo tanto, el abuso y el maltrato se da por la edad, pero también porque, por su condición de ser niñas y de ser mujeres, ¿no? Pueden ser asesinadas por personas cercanas o cualquier familiar, pero también son asesinadas por desconocidos. En este sentido, una de las investigadoras en nuestro país que ha abundado más sobre este tema destaca que muchas de estas menores han sido víctimas de una violencia sistemática que da como resultado una vida llena de terror, situación que han debido sortear con su escasa edad, con sus pocas posibilidades para enfrentar estas violencias. Y aquí es donde dejo la primera reflexión. ¿Qué hacen los sistemas educativos para detectar estas violencias? Cuando las niñas, las adolescentes asisten a la escuela y están ya viviendo estas violencias en casas de abuso, de violaciones, incluso de violación sexual, de abuso sexual y violencias múltiples, física, psicológica, etcétera. Y yo pregunto, ¿los sistemas educativos están preparados para detectar estas violencias, para atender a esas niñas, para cuidarlas y para prevenir un feminicidio incluso, ¿no? En la documentación del feminicidio, tanto en México como en América Latina y el Caribe, se invisibiliza las particularidades de las niñas y los adolescentes. En los informes institucionales se destaca que en el caso de la infancia, el homicidio de niñas ha sido más alarmante en comparación que los niños. Por ejemplo, las defunciones femeninas con presunción de homicidio, 17.2% correspondieron a menores de 18 años. Más de una de cada 20 tenía menos de 5 años y 2.4% no alcanzaban no alcanzaban el año de edad. Se trata de un hecho al que no se le ha prestado la atención requerida y que constituye una fuerte llamada de atención para la sociedad. Yo, en las investigaciones que he hecho, yo he documentado los casos de feminicidio y asesinatos de niñas y mujeres en mi país, en México, desde 1997 hasta la fecha. Y parte de mis hallazgos han sido que en los extremos de la vida, tanto en la primera parte de la vida como en el extremo último, en las personas mayores, se encuentran además en una mayor vulnerabilidad y son distintas las motivaciones para privarles de la vida. Pero particularmente en el caso de la primera etapa de vida de las niñas y de las adolescentes, uno de los componentes de motivación que siempre va a estar presente es la violencia sexual. Es decir, además de privarlas de la vida, vamos a tener ahí violencia sexual antes, durante o después de la privación de la vida. Si bien se reconoce una alta proporción de niñas y adolescentes asesinadas en nuestro país, en México persiste además el olvido de las niñas rurales, de las niñas indígenas, de las niñas afromexicanas asesinadas, sobre todo las violencias acumuladas y su imbricación, pobreza racializada, edad, etnicidad, ser niña. La infancia es la etapa en que son asesinadas más mujeres que hombres. Ojo con esto, también acá en esta problemática de los feminicidios, también hay una mayor violencia en esa primera etapa, en la niñez y en la adolescencia, contra las niñas, ¿no? Cuando son adultos se matan entre los hombres. Uno de los informes con los que contamos acá señala que desde el año 2000 ha habido grandes diferencias en las proporciones de niñas y adultas mayores asesinadas con respecto a niños y adultos mayores asesinados. Las niñas de 0 a 11 años en 2002, por ejemplo, representaron el 10.1% de las mujeres asesinadas. En contraparte, en el mismo grupo de edad, los niños representaron el 2.1% de los asesinatos de hombres. Bueno, en relación con la orfandad por feminicidio, el gobierno de México ha censado a 5,072 niñas y niños en orfandad por el asesinato de sus madres en manos de sus parejas o exparejas desde diciembre de 2018 hasta abril de 2021. Para dar una atención a esto, se generó un protocolo de atención integral a niñas, niños y adolescentes en condición de orfandad por feminicidio. Y aquí coloco la siguiente reflexión. ¿Qué hacen también los sistemas educativos para atender a esas niñas, niños y adolescentes huérfanos de feminicidio? En muchos de los casos, bueno, además a mí, que soy, además de ser profesora, investigadora, soy activista, soy defensora de los derechos humanos y acompaño a las familias en estos procesos. Bueno, conozco muchos casos de niñas y de niños que vieron a sus papás asesinar a sus mamás, ¿no? Entonces, no solamente es que se quedaron huérfanos, no es solamente que perdieron a su mamá, perdieron a su papá también, porque además él es el que le privó de la vida a su mamá, y además se quedan con una afectación psicológica tremenda, ¿no? Pasan de estar en una familia, pasan a depender de familias secundarias, de la tía, del abuelo, del hermano. Pues es decir, hay una serie de problemáticas, a veces les cambian de escuela o siguen en la misma escuela con este estigma de que sus mamás fueron asesinadas por sus papás, y no había hasta hace poco ni atención psicológica, ni económica, ni de ningún tipo para estos niñas y niños huérfanos de feminicidio, y en las escuelas no hay absolutamente nada tampoco de atención, que brinda atención a estas niñas y adolescentes que han vivido estos grados de violencia. Bueno, ya para concluir, es necesario superar los diversos desafíos de violencias estructurales que implica pensar en el reconocimiento de las condiciones de opresión profundamente imbricadas que sufren las mujeres, las niñas y las adolescentes como parte de un proceso de exclusión histórica. Hay que reconocer que las acciones deben ser situadas, regionales e incluyentes. También poner especial atención en las niñas y adolescentes y que la erradicación de las violencias incluya la eliminación de la discriminación étnico-racial, transversalizar los derechos humanos para la población afrodescendiente, rural e indígena. Recoger información adecuada sobre las víctimas y victimarios. Para el caso del feminicidio infantil es necesario ir más allá de la clasificación dicotómica de 18 años y más y menos de 18 años, porque nos hemos encontrado en el caso mexicano que muchos casos de asesinatos de niñas y de adolescentes no los consignan como feminicidios, no las consideran mujeres, ¿no? Es una cosa rara porque no las consignan como feminicidios y van a ser otro tipo de delitos como homicidios, infanticidios, pero no como el feminicidio infantil. Bueno, históricamente la educación ha servido de sostén y reproductor de un sistema heteropatriarcal que oprime, excluye y discrimina a las niñas y a las mujeres. En una sociedad heteronormativa, las relaciones de género se basan en estructuras de reparto del poder desigual. Y esa desigualdad unida a la violencia de género contra las mujeres es estructural y sistémica, porque existe todo un sistema y una estructura social, política, económica, cultural, jurídica, social, etcétera, que promueve, permite, genera la desigualdad y la violencia contra las mujeres. En este sentido, la educación ha sido un factor clave. Y yo aquí lo que propongo justamente es que reformulemos en el otro sentido, ¿no? También la educación constituye una herramienta de cambio y transformación. Es decir, la educación no solo es un derecho humano, sino que también es un proceso de emancipación y libertad que puede contribuir a la erradicación de las violencias y los feminicidios, particularmente contra las niñas y las adolescentes. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias, Lupita. Muchas gracias por llamar nuestra atención sobre la importancia del lenguaje y por llamar la atención también sobre o formular estas dos preguntas que sin duda nos serán muy útiles para el debate. Well, now we have 5 minutes for a break. So see you in 5 minutes, depending on your time. I don't know, 3 or 5, and then we will hear Teresa. Okay. Well, welcome back. The time for the break is over, and now it's time for our last speaker today. I welcome Mrs. Teresa Mondi. Mrs. Teresa, are you there? Okay, nice to see you. Over to you, Mrs. Teresa.
Thank you very much, Louis. You can hear me?
Yes, I hear you well.
Okay, let me try and share my presentation.
Brilliant.
Okay.
Yeah, it works.
Okay. Okay.
Maybe you can make bigger.
Yes, there. Okay,
Excellent.
and I'll
Thank
save
you.
time on the introduction page. I just want to say I've been so excited to listen to our friends from Mexico on the femicide situation in Mexico, and also the challenges that are faced in Myanmar. I had a classmate from that country, and it was nice to still hear about what is happening and the activities and interventions that they're still trying to make it a better place. So I'll not be sharing anything much further from what is happening with our partners in Africa. It's more or less the same, just that it's different situations, but the challenges of the girl child are still the same, especially in conflict areas. And what a great day to speak about these challenges on a day that we are celebrating Girls' Day, International Day of the Girl Child. And as we celebrate the good things, it's important that we are also mentioning where the challenges still are and what we are doing about them. So FAR is a Pan-African non-governmental organization. We are a membership organization. The members comprise of educationalists. That's why it's Forum for African Women Educationalists. So you are either a minister of education or a professor in the university, but someone who is working in the education sector as a member, and other friends of PAWE who are in the education sector. And our niche basically is to advocate for the gender policies and practices in Africa that are gender responsive and favorable for girls' education in Africa. We are found in 33 countries in Africa, sub-Saharan Africa majorly. We still don't have chapters in the northern part of Africa, but 33 other chapters. And our strategic approach basically is advocacy, demonstrative intervention. When I talk about demonstrative intervention, I'm talking about gender responsive education, encouraging girls to take up STEM subjects, about Tuseme clubs. Tuseme is a Swahili word meaning let's speak out. So we have clubs in school or speaking out and sharing. So you'll hear me mentioning a few of these things in my presentation. So FAWE's work around issues of conflict situation, this is an area that is relatively new in terms of the organization. We are 30 years old. So I'd say this has happened in the last few years of our operations. And we try to support girls in education post-conflict situation by providing scholarships for these girls, because things after a conflict, poverty increases, sometimes resources, sometimes even location of family members. So if we're able to get some of these girls who are still willing to go back to school, FAWE provides that form of scholarship. We also have partnerships with TVETs, because we also know that after a conflict, not so many of the girls would go back to the formal schools. So any education that would give them skills that would make them do something useful for themselves and their future societies, then as FAWE, we invest in the technical voluntary education trainings for girls. And this example has been for FAWE Liberia and FAWE Sierra Leone. After the conflict in their countries, most of the girls preferred to go to TVET because, of course, age had caught up, and also some had gotten pregnant. And so it was a matter of taking an education format that would have been reasonable for them at that particular time as they continue taking care of their children or their families. So Liberia and Sierra Leone are really quite our case study. And these are also the countries that helped us also manage during the COVID-19 times. When people were talking about learning from past experiences, FAWE was able to learn from Liberia and Sierra Leone as we came up with our intervention during the COVID-19 time. Though it wasn't really conflict time, but pandemic times and conflict times are more or less the same in terms of the intervention that you may need. We've had mothers clubs in Uganda. There's a school called Padare Girls in Uganda. And here in Uganda, you know, the Lord's forces were taking girls actually as part of the soldiers. And the girls who are being taken, they're specifically being targeted, different from what happened in Nigeria. In Uganda, they were being taken because of their education so that they can help the resistance movement to communicate to the external world or the external community. So a lot of girls who are abducted, of course, in the process of being interpreters and helping with the education factor, they also, some of them unfortunately raped, or some of them got pregnant. And so the mothers clubs in Uganda have been able to support these girls after the conflict period. Then recently we have worked on data evidence, because a lot of times we speak about these girls, we don't give a face to these girls, and you can give a face to these girls by using numbers. So we used advocacy data for evidence advocacy for Kenya, and we were targeting urban area called Isli, where we have a lot of our Somali communities, and also Sudanese communities, those who fled from war. And that is in the Nairobi capital city. But then we also had Turkana, which is also a refugee camp that hosts quite a number of refugees from Uganda, Sudan, as well as Somalia. And you would know, according to the UN data, Kenya is one of the countries that hosts the largest numbers of refugees in Africa. So in that, we collected data, and with numbers, we were advocating for change, for provision of gender-specific supplies, both for girls and also the boys, but mostly also looking at the education of girls from these conflict areas. So the challenges that we have continued to have, there's conflict leads to loss of livelihood and change of social roles. When we talk about loss of livelihood in Africa, basically everything stops. Sometimes I try to make comparison to the European conflicts, not to try and compare in terms of the sad effects, but basically things stop totally in the African context. And if you look at even what is happening currently in Burkina Faso, we cannot even operate as a chapter. We can no longer do the activities. You have to be in certain areas, curfews, and the economy does not necessarily move, and the support also is not as fast, depending on which country this is happening. So there's loss of livelihood. And when we talk about change of social roles, for example, a lot of times in African context, the men are seen as the head of households and the ones who provide for families. But these are the men who've gone to war. Probably most of them have passed on. And this role now automatically now just changing to women, and mostly the girl child takes up social roles that are not ordinarily their roles in their society. So that's just an example of what I mean by social roles. Support structures are disrupted during the post-conflict. The first, you'll notice even during the COVID-19 time, the first places to be affected are schools, they closed. Then the next thing with the social support is that the needs of girls and women become less urgent. If anything, it becomes peripheral. I would give an example in Kenya. Even the supply of reproductive health products was not there. And when we would start questioning the government, and they would say, that's not a priority now, we are all looking at the vaccines for COVID. So as just an example of how structures fail, and the needs of girls and women become secondary, if not even last or forgotten totally. And what happens? You have to again start to fight for these rights post the conflict, or even post the pandemic, if I would say. Then conflict increases the barrier of boys, the differences between boys and girls, that at least we have noticed. And I want to say that it's no longer the situation that it's only boys who are recruited to be soldiers. I've just given you an example that girls also can be recruited to be soldiers or as weapons of war. So at the end of the day, the inequality gaps, because the roles as to why they are being abducted or joining situations of conflict are totally, of course, very different. Girls are, I would say there's a lot of sexual violence against girls and women, as opposed to the roles that the boys are picked for in the camps. Then we have the experience of girls and women differ in the conflict situation, just exactly what I was explaining. And so we need different types of intervention when we are coming in to support them. Then according to the UN, 70% of women have the face of GBV during post-conflict. I've already explained the examples, especially when we are used as weapons of war. And lastly, poverty and disability also contribute to more vulnerability of women and girls during this situation. When your social roles change, when now it's the girls who are heads of families, it's the girls who are taking care of the children, it's the women who are fending for the families, there's no that equal support, then vulnerability increases in such kind of situations. So those are just some of the challenges. So the other issue is also on the reallocation of resources and the priorities at households in terms of conflict. A lot goes into protection and security, and the other needs, basic reproductive health needs or basic needs of women and girls, get not put at the periphery, let me say that. Then we have the triple or double burden for caring for children and elderly relatives. I've already spoken about the social roles changing, and also the idea of recruitment into armed forces by the rebels or any soldiers or in any situation, depending on the different types of conflicts. So there's also movement restriction in most areas. I've just given you also an example of what is happening now in Burkina Faso. And the other challenge that we currently have, I'm not sure whether we have this in other countries outside Africa, is the competition between the refugee and the host communities. In Kenya, for example, the Kakuma camp, which is in Turukana, I was just sharing with you about data evidence in Turukana. Host communities actually complain that the refugees get treated better than they who are hosting the refugees. But basically it's because most of the international organizations ensure that the camps have water, have food supply, have clothes, which is not necessarily the situation for the surrounding host communities. So in that situation, there's a lot of conflict. And where there's conflict, like I already said, the biggest burden lies with the women and children in those societies. Then socioeconomic pressures, which lead to engagement of transactional sex. We've seen this before. We've seen also where, because of that level of need, that you give into sex, not because that's what your will is, but it becomes kind of like a transactional tool for economic provisions or needs. And we gave an example of the South Sudan, where 52% of girls in the country were married before their 18th birthday. And Sierra Leone, we had over 65 who were engaged in the home. So as the intervention, as I almost come to the conclusion, we continue to do research. We partner with different organizations. Interagency Education in Emergency is one of the organizations, and Equal Measures, to continuously provide evidence on how conflict impacts on girls and women in Africa. We continue to work with TVET so that we support the out of school girls. Like I said, sometimes coming back from school, coming back to the formal school or the formal schedule for school becomes quite difficult for some of these girls after conflict. We advocate for re-entry of teenage mothers back to school. We also work on gender responsive pedagogy for teachers, that is having teachers who are more responsive to the needs of boys and girls in their classes, not only by the way they teach, but also the type of material that they use for teaching in these situations. And like I said, in conflict times, girls and boys experience it differently. So a teacher who really understands how to give examples in class, not to make fun of any of the situation, then these are some of the gender responsive pedagogy we are using. And then we have also developed a school-related gender-based violence toolkit or a manual, which we are also using to identify GBV in conflict situation. There's a whole chapter in the manual that describes GBV in conflict situation. And like I said, also comprehensive scholarship is still going on. So some of the studies, I'm sure you will get copies of this presentation. These two on the farthest right of the PowerPoint, where we have done one titled Mind the Gap, which is the state of girls' education in crisis and conflict. We did it with the interagency education in emergency, and also the strengthening of girls' education in emergencies with human rights organizations. So we recommend very quickly that there's need for gender disaggregated data, which is work that we're already doing, but we need more partners, we need more people to be engaged in gender disaggregated data. Otherwise, our story becomes just another story. Then community participation to engage humanitarian response. There should be nothing for them without them. And then explore alternative education mechanism. The TVET idea is quite a useful idea. Okay, thank you, Louis, for testing that. Then explore, we need also to explore alternative education mechanisms, like I said, TVET. And beyond TVET, we can have homeschooling, we can have any other ways of bringing in skills for our girls. Then provide financial and in-kind support for the girls in their families, responding to their, because not all girls in Africa are the same. A girl in Kenya is very different from Burkina Faso or Sierra Leone or Senegal. So it depends. We have to be responsive also to their environment. And then transformation of school environment. I've just talked about the gender responsive teaching materials, teaching environment, the schools, so that we are able to address the different needs of boys and girls. And also, as I said, the financial support to the families. I think that brings me to the end of the presentation by just giving this conclusion that educating girls has a long-term positive dividends related to peace and security. Malala Fund did this study in 2017 on the relation between girls or women and peace and security. Then educated mothers are more likely also to prioritize education for their own children. And also education has enormous potential to protect girls to mitigate the effects of emergency. I think with more educated girls and also boys, then we have a high chance of protecting ourselves from conflict and also responding to emergency situations. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Teresa. Thank you very much for joining us today and your wonderful presentation. Lots of examples, very interesting indeed. So now is the time for our Q&A. So I invite you all to raise your hand, and my colleague Salma will open the microphone for you. So please don't be shy. I am sure there are many questions to ask, many comments. So please feel free. I don't see at the moment. Let me see. How can I see that? Any person want to make a question or a comment? Of course, the speakers are also invited to ask questions among yourselves. Maybe, yeah. I see some messages here, but I don't know. Salma, do you see anyone wanted to ask a question or something like that?
This is Stephanie. I have a question for the other panelists. Okay. I'm curious from your perspectives, how you best see engaging young women and girls in developing these solutions, because I think we all know, because we work on this all the time, the statistics and the power of girls' education and education for young women for not only their own agency, but for their communities. But I think sometimes policymakers are less, don't often think about how to engage them, the young women and girls themselves, in actually policy and program development. So from your perspectives, I'm curious what best practices you've seen to do that, so that their views can actually be part of the solutions that go forward.
So, who want to be first?
Bueno, yo
I see
puedo,
Berno.
muchas gracias, voy a hablar en español, es más fácil. Yo creo que la participación específicamente de mujeres jóvenes es fundamental para cualquier organización. Y para ello se requiere precisamente romper con modelos patriarcales, por un lado, que han mantenido alejadas de la toma de decisiones a las personas jóvenes en general y especialmente a las mujeres. Y por otra parte es necesario también hacer esfuerzos ingentes para involucrar a las personas jóvenes, para abrirle las puertas en nuestras organizaciones, en nuestras coaliciones, entre los miembros de la campaña mundial por la educación. Hemos visto cómo muchas mujeres jóvenes han sido instrumentalizadas, han sido utilizadas en diferentes foros para representar constituyentes que no tienen realmente. Y nos parece, por lo tanto, necesario avanzar en el apoyo a la construcción de un movimiento organizado, legítimo, que responda a las necesidades, intereses y derechos de las personas jóvenes. Pensamos que esto es una acción que desde la campaña mundial debemos fortalecer y por lo tanto creemos que el liderazgo de las mujeres jóvenes debe ser tomado muy en serio y tratamos de hacerlo desde la campaña mundial. Gracias, Luis Eduardo. Gracias, Stephanie.
Gracias, Bernard. Wondering, Teresa, if you want to address Stephanie's question, and lo mismo para ti, María Guadalupe, si quieres hacer algún comentario sobre la pregunta de Stephanie.
Can I go next?
Yes, please, Teresa, go
Okay.
ahead.
So good question, because if the policy makers do not know what to do, because there's also that assumption that the policy makers should know. But unfortunately, especially in the African context, most of our policy makers are also politicians. So it's not necessarily the agenda that got them into that position is our agenda. So how do we get them involved? Inviting them to our forums, sending them our position papers, asking them to join in part of our workshops or validation workshops, where they get to really understand what is the story behind this specific issue. For instance, when we were working on the data for evidence, we actually had to involve the Ministry of Education and ask their officials to join into part of these meetings. That way, then they get to know what exactly is happening. It's not a surety they'll do something about it, but at least you would be confident that they at least know that there is a challenge in that specific area. And lastly, you have to give them on a plate, basically almost with a fork and a knife ready to eat. Because if you ask them to do the research, I don't know, ask them to go and you will not get the results. So you really have to present it ready-made, steady for just swallowing and enjoying the meal if there's something like that.
Thank you, Teresa, for being so clear about this. So, Guadalupe, ¿quieres decir algo sobre la pregunta de Stephanie? O... Te escuchamos.
¿A mí?
Sí, si quieres decir algo, si no, está bien.
Sí, claro. No, sí, por supuesto. Yo hablaba hace un momento que la problemática tiene como esas dos vertientes de ser estructural y sistémica y la respuesta no ha sido en el mismo sentido, ¿no? Entonces necesitamos respuestas que sean estructurales y sistémicas, que vayan al fondo del problema y que pues existan cambios así estructurales, trascendentales, transversales, que puedan generar posibilidades de una mejor vida para las niñas y para las adolescentes, en todos los sentidos y con todas las problemáticas que hemos planteado acá, ¿no? En los distintos lugares, en los distintos países, ¿no? Entonces, sin duda, pues bueno, primero es ver este mundo heteropatriarcal, con todas las discriminaciones históricas que hemos vivido las niñas y las mujeres, cómo se van a atacar y cómo se van a cambiar si no es con una mirada así también que sea de la misma dimensión que la problemática, ¿no? Es decir, con respuestas estructurales y sistemáticas.
Gracias, María Guadalupe. Now, Susmita, over to you, Susmita.
Thank you very much, Luis. And what I would like to add on is that in our experience, what we have seen is that building the capacity of the young women, that has helped, because after that, they have been engaged in research work, as Teresa just said, that we have to give them a kind of a plate. So that is like enhancing their capacity. And in India, we have seen that they have been engaged in youth action research, and then they have taken up those recommendations up to the local government. The other thing that I feel is that the very strategic utilization of the students' union. I know those are political unions, but if we can use them or strategically use them, that can also sometimes be helpful. But we have to be very strategic, being that they are very, very political, at least what I see in India. Thank you.
Thank you, Sunita. Thank you very much. And wondering if anybody has another question. I have one for Stephanie Foster. I have the opportunity to read your book, and I see that being a very practical tool for women and girls, or for advocating for women's and girl right to education. And I am aware of your work in Afghanistan. So I was wondering, for example, how it's possible to use this very important practical tool for advocating for girls and women's rights in a context such as Afghanistan, that I know you are very familiar with because of your experience working there. So can you share a little bit the limitations of using these tools in contexts like that?
Sure, and thanks for the question. So just to back up so people are all on the same page, literally, I did write a book about taking action for women and girls, and really looking at an advocacy framework to ensure that people who want to be activists or who want to take advocacy steps have some ideas about what to do. Because again, we on this call are all people who do this every day, but most people have some interest and commitment, I think, to making gender equality a priority, but don't necessarily know kind of the first step. So I talk in the book about very practical things that you can do, from the basic, like who owns the business you're buying your coffee from or your accounting services from, to a policy advocacy framework. So from the very individual kind of action to the policy action. And I focus on 4 issues: girls' education, economic empowerment, political participation, and the need to address violence, gender-based violence. So, and in all of those, particularly girls' education, I mean, there is, again, a lot of interest in advocacy. And so really looking at that framework in terms of how you can understand who else is doing work in the area, say girls' education, what are their groups, what sort of interventions and programs you might be interested in promoting, because there are lots of things that work, but as all the panelists have demonstrated, they work differently, or they're more effective in some places than others, depending on the context, depending on what's gone on in that community. Some places may be more interested or more amenable to issues around incentives to keep girls in schools, whether that's cash transfers or other things. Some it might be a lot around security. Some it's around getting more women teachers, because families want their kids to be taught, their young women to be taught by female teachers. So it's all around what interventions might actually work in those particular countries. I mean, I think, and it sets out a framework for how to actually make those arguments as an advocate and ask the right questions to get started, meet with policymakers, educate others in your community, and all of the, a lot of steps around that. I mean, I do think in terms of advocacy, and several people have talked about this, advocacy isn't a straight line. You don't start today and get to your goal tomorrow necessarily. You have often, it's kind of a, it's a winding path. And so in some situations, advocacy meets its goal fairly quickly. Most often it takes a long time and kind of goes off in various ways. But then, you might have to change your goal. You might have to think about how to really develop in a way that brings more people along. You often have to compromise as a policy advocate or make a decision about whether you're going to compromise. So I think there's a lot embedded in that discussion around advocacy. I think there are situations where advocacy is very challenging. You mentioned Afghanistan. I don't think that's the only place where it's just really hard. You have to, keep pushing, understanding that sometimes advocacy is really more about continuing to keep people engaged on the issue, as opposed to necessarily a policy, goal or a programming goal. I think that's true often around the world, that keeping key issues around girls' education at the top of people's agendas is in and of itself important. It's not, I'm sure if you're a girl who's not able to go to school, that seems very it doesn't make sense, right? That people are talking about my right to go to school, but I can't go to school. But I do think at the very least, in situations that seem very difficult, the most important thing we can do is keep people talking about it so that people don't forget what's happening and that people understand the long-term impact of, say, not allowing a wide, large number of, in the case of Afghanistan, girls go to secondary school. In other places around the world, it might be a certain ethnic group, or it might be a certain, group of people who live in a rural area. So I think that a lot of it is really understanding that advocacy is a long-term process. Sometimes you can really focus on a policy, a programmatic goal. And then sometimes it's really about keeping the conversation going and keeping people engaged so that they not only understand what's happening, but that they understand the impact on that particular country, but really often on all of us, because what happens in one place really has an impact on people around the world. And we often don't talk about it in those terms. We are all safer, more secure, and able to live in a more prosperous world when everybody has equal access to education and equal access to the economy and equal access to civic engagement. So I think we just need to keep pushing forward on that conversation. But thank you for the question.
Thank you, Stephanie. Thank you very much. I just want to make sure that there are maybe questions here. Salma, you see some questions from the attendees?
No, nothing.
No, I will take advantage of that because I don't really want to miss this opportunity. I have a question for Teresa. Teresa, you raised this very important issue about the tensions between the so-called host communities and refugees. And we see, for example, in the ground, many international organizations offering, for example, tools or kits for children. How do you manage an organization like FAWE this in everyday life? Not to make more complex the situation when people have not really something to eat, but they are not refugees. And how is the process? Please share with us some insights from your experience.
Thank you very much. So what we have done before in our events is that we ensure that in fact, we try as much as possible to convince whichever development partner who is working with us that in any training of teachers, we must have mixed refugee teachers and community teachers, host community teachers. Sometimes you try and work on a percentage of 70-30, because every development partner comes with their different interests. And that also translates to children. So we do not only go to schools within the refugee camps, but also work with schools within the communities. That way then, And it's actually from that where we really get a lot of examples and experiences of how the host communities feel more marginalized than the refugees. But also you have to tell the community, the host communities, that some of those refugees are not necessarily, people think all refugees are poor people who did not have a home, yet there are some refugees there who are doctors, there's refugees there who are teachers, there are refugees there who are nurses. Some of those refugees are the ones who work in the community hospitals or the centers. So it's just a matter of continuously trying to engage them on the benefits of having both of them in the team. But the most important one that has worked is mixed activities. So they don't feel like it's only activities for refugees.
Yeah, thank you, Teresa. That really makes a lot of sense, because the way the media or the international media portray refugees is always like passive victims just asking for help, but we just ignore that we have people with different talents and background that can contribute to our communities and make our communities better and richer in many ways. Thank you. And I also want to take the opportunity to ask Maria Guadalupe, so I am going now to move into Spanish. Maria Guadalupe, tú mencionas dos preguntas muy importantes. ¿Qué hacen los sistemas educativos para, digamos, atender las necesidades educativas de niños y niñas cuyas madres han sido asesinadas? ¿Tienes, digamos, algún tipo de información? Si tú respondes esa pregunta en el contexto mexicano, ¿qué podrías decirnos?
Y muchas gracias por la pregunta. Bueno, en realidad no existe, ¿no? Por eso es que lanzaba yo esas dos preocupaciones y reflexiones en torno tanto a los feminicidios infantiles y adolescentes como el caso de la orfandad, ¿no? De las niñas y niños huérfanos de feminicidio, porque apenas hasta hace muy poco tiempo es que el gobierno mexicano promueve y se promulga este protocolo de atención integral para niños huérfanos de feminicidio, pero esto fue después de que de una pues acción social muy fuerte que hemos dado para que, primero para visibilizar esas problemáticas, porque eran niñas y niños totalmente olvidados, ¿no? Es decir, ocurrían esos asesinatos y no había, desde el Estado, no había nadie que atendiera y que pudiese resolver algunas de las problemáticas que se presentan alrededor de estas niñas y niños y adolescentes, ¿no? Y ni hablar del sistema educativo, ¿no? El sistema educativo de plano no tiene absolutamente nada dentro de sus protocolos de atención, nada, ¿no? Entonces, eso es muy preocupante. Una, porque es un gran potencial que se tiene desde las escuelas, desde el sistema educativo, primero para detectar esas violencias que viven no solamente las niñas, niños y adolescentes, sino las de su entorno familiar, ¿no? Las que puedan estar viviendo en ese entorno familiar y que puedan prevenir algún posible violencia mayor, ¿no? Con una atención inmediata, con una denuncia adecuada, acompañamiento de denuncia en su momento y demás. Y por otro lado, tampoco existe ese acompañamiento desde las escuelas, desde el sistema educativo, para estas niñas y niños que viven esos extremos de violencia, ¿no? No solamente los casos de feminicidio y de los casos de feminicidio y de violencia doméstica, sino que ahora le sumamos el tema de las desapariciones. Desafortunadamente en nuestro país es uno de los países con una problemática de desapariciones, con un número muy alto, ¿no? Más de 100,000 personas desaparecidas y un número muy importante de mujeres y sobre todo de niñas que hacen presumir que la relación de este delito de desaparición con otros delitos que pueden ser la explotación sexual, la trata, etcétera, ¿no? Y que no ha sido adecuadamente investigado, o sea, no existe una investigación adecuada que correlacione esos delitos, por un lado, pero tampoco desde las escuelas. A mí me llama mucho la atención y me preocupa mucho, por supuesto, me entristece que desde un sistema educativo existe esta indolencia hacia esas dos problemáticas, la desaparición de niñas, jóvenes, adolescentes y el tema de feminicidios infantiles, adolescentes y la orfandad. esos tres problemas. Y digo por qué, porque desde la escuela, cuando una niña deja de ir a la escuela, cuando ya no está, cuando les desaparecen justamente estas niñas, digo, ¿y qué hace el sistema educativo? ¿Dónde está su accionar para por lo menos lanzar esta preocupación de por qué están desapareciendo a las jóvenes, a las niñas, a las adolescentes, ¿no? Y lo mismo en torno a la problemática de feminicidios. Es decir, yo creo que sí el llamado es a no naturalizar esas violencias, ¿no? Que no sea normal que un día una alumna dejó de venir a clases y ya, pues ya no subimos nada de ella, ¿no? Sino cuestionar por qué no vino, por qué no está, incluso hasta la movilización social, ¿no? Porque esa estudiante que estaba y ya dejó de asistir a la escuela, ¿no? Entonces aquí debe de existir un mayor involucramiento social y por supuesto desde el sistema educativo para estas problemáticas que están afectando gravemente a nuestro país. Amén.
Gracias, María Guadalupe. Es un gusto tenerte con nosotros y que compartas toda esta valiosa, no solo información, sino conocimiento. Y ahora, okay, sorry, I have a question for you all because Teresa is kindly inviting us for a group photo. So if you feel comfortable with that, just say like that, and Teresa, you can take the photo. And meanwhile, I will just ask a question for Sumita, so after the photo. So is the photo ready? The interpreters are also welcome to show your face if you want, because you are part of the event doing such a great role. So feel free to just open your camera if you want.
Give me
If not,
1 minute. Just give me 1 minute to set
okay,
this up.
now
Just
smiling.
30 seconds.
Louise,
Okay.
there's someone with their hand up. I'm not sure if they can ask their question, if you still have time.
Okay, no, there, yes, please go ahead with the question.
Okay, let me
Wonderful. So
I'm
I don't know who
allowing
is
them to
that
speak.
person.
Yeah, so
Sure. Okay, are we ready?
Ready for the photo, and then I will hear Gulan with the question.
yes.
Okay, so Salma, are you on? Just checking, I'm not leaving anyone.
Thank you all for the great presentations.
Hello.
Appreciate such
Okay,
opportunities to learn from your experiences
okay.
and to use them in our context to advocate for education, particularly for the girls' education, which is our top priority nowadays.
Hello.
Hello. So Gulan, it
Yeah.
was Gulan, the person who was speaking?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
We
Yes.
can ask them all to open their cameras if they can.
Yes, open the camera. Had you already taken the picture?
Yeah. Due to
Okay,
security
so-
reasons, we are a bit cautious not to have our picture visible. You know, we are undergoing a critical situation in this country.
Okay.
Especially those who are working for girls' education, who are advocating for girls' education, they are not good people for the current government.
Okay, no, I completely understand. Please don't do that. Yes,
Right.
and yeah.
Thank you.
So anybody has a comment about the comment raised by Gulan, or everything is fine? So my question to Sumita, Sumita, I was very impressed about the figure of 12 million students leaving school in Myanmar. Is that a temporary situation? What do you see that would be the solution in the near future for 12 million students in a single country?
I couldn't get it like that.
Yeah, this is basically the UNICEF report of Myanmar that 12 million children are out of school. They have missed the school opportunity, and that's where comes the community education movement, where several civil societies are engaged. And they are actually trying to bring in those students together as per the ethnic group, because in Myanmar, there are strong ethnic communities and they have their own ways of like teaching, and they prefer to be in their own group. So they are bringing them in their own community education, where, as they say, that any place can be where you can have a school or start education if the community wants. So that is the way they are getting into that community education movement. And there are several that have come up in all over Myanmar, but those are very much under the radar of the military. Let's hope that they can continue. The civil societies are also very much under the radar of the military. So many of them have been detained or jailed and also executed, which is like horrible that is happening. So it's just we can wait and see if things becomes better. But these community education are very much well accepted within the community, especially in those regions where there are those ethnic groups.
Thank you,
And thank you,
Susmita.
Ghulam. He's our Afghan National Education Coalition Director. So thank you, Ghulam, for your message over here. Very nice to see you in the meeting today.
Most welcome, Ms. Susmita. Thanks for all of you. Great information, great presentations. We used so much.
Thank you. So it is now time for closing our session. I want to thank you all the speakers for making time for this, for preparing your presentation, for sharing your knowledge. This is very much appreciated on behalf of the Global Campaign for Education. And as we are now planning our next Education in Emergency Learning Community, it will be in December, and I want to invite you all to join us. We are going to discuss the impacts of the apartheid in South Africa on education. We rarely see apartheid as an emergency, but I do believe this is an emergency that only not happened in the past, but they still have some sequels that are important to understand. So we are planning our next seminar around this very important issue that we can all learn depending on or disregard where we are. So thank you very much for you all, and see you in the future. Thank you, Lauren, and all for your support with this, and my colleague Salma and all the interpreters for their hard work with that. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you, colleague.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you. Bye.
Bye and have a